1 to 6, the Quran speaks about a battle that has already taken place, the Romans have been defeated in a nearby land. And then there was a prediction that within a few years, this situation will turn around. And not only that, but the Muslims, the believers, will delight over the victory that God will grant. So, Sayyid Abu al-Mawdudi, in his Tafhim al-Quran, has traced in his footnotes the history of the battle between the Romans and the Persians, and he has shown that this revelation was given in the Meccan period in the year 614, and Br in Arabic actually means anything between 3 to 9. So add 9 to 614, that's 623. By 623, the Romans actually turned around and won a crushing victory against the Persians. And what else happened in the year 623? 622, according to historians generally, was the year of the hijrah of the Prophet Muhammad from Mecca to Medina. And we've already saw in our lecture today, the first year after the hijrah was the Battle of Badr. So in the Battle of Badr, there were just 300 Muslims facing a 1,000-strong army. The Muslims were ill-equipped. The non-Muslim army was actually armed to the teeth. And yet the Muslims won, and they were convinced that this victory was given to them by God. And the history of the Battle of Badr is well known. So simultaneously, the Romans were winning their victory, and the Muslims were also winning their victory at the Battle of Badr. Two circumstances coinciding at once, and obviously the Prophet Muhammad could not control the unfolding of these events. And that verse actually spoke about the coincidence of these events, as depicted by Sayyid al-Mawdudi in his Tafhim al-Quran. So I think that's very clear. Surah 30 verses 1 to 6 speaks about the future, and then the future unfolds exactly as the Quran has already outlined. But let's continue. There is more. Traditionally, Muslim scholars have spoken about the challenge of the Quran. And before I get to what they specifically have said about this, I'd like to also mention an indirect and a lesser challenge, but nevertheless a significant one. We know that we as human beings are very conscious of our errors. And if we write something, we are always apprehensive lest someone might find some error in what we have written. Nobody writes something and says, look, this is free of error, because he knows that once you say this, somebody will try to find some error in it. That's just human nature. You put a sign on the wall saying wet paint, and somebody will come try touching it to see if it's really wet paint. Isn't it human nature? So when you state something categorically, somebody will try to disprove you. And notice that the Quran declares itself to be free of error. For example, in Surah 4, verse 82, أَفَلَا يَتَدَبَّرُونَ الْقُرْآنَ, have they not pondered the Quran with care? وَلَوْ كَانَ مِنْ عِنْدِ غَيْرِ اللَّهِ لَوَجَدُوا فِيهِ اخْتِلَافًا كَثِيرًا. If it had been from any other than God, they would have found therein much discrepancy. Now indeed, people have tried to find discrepancy in the Quran and prove error in the book, but they have not shown us anything except examples of their own misunderstanding or poor understanding of the book itself. But those who are careful students of the Quran will find that the Quran is a consistent whole, the very thing that the Quran keeps claiming for itself. So that is a minor challenge, and one that withstood the test of time. But when classical Muslim scholars spoke of the challenge of the Quran, they spoke of the Quran as being inimitable. They said that the Quran, though being obviously a book composed of ordinary letters of the Arabic language, is yet of such a sublime character that the best and the most eloquent of Arabs, people who specialize in composing beautiful recitations, were not able to produce something like it. But even though the Quran kept saying again and again, produce something like it to prove your case against the Quran. For example, in Surah 2, verse 24, where the Quran says, وَإِن كُنتُمْ فِي رَيْبٍ مِّمَّا نَزَّلْنَا عَلَىٰ عَبْدِنَا فَأْتُوا بِسُورَةٍ مِّمِثْلِهِ وَادْعُوا شُهَدَاءَكُم مِّن دُونِ اللَّهِ إِن كُنتُمْ صَادِقِينَ. If you are in doubt concerning what we reveal to our servant, then produce a surah of similar nature to it, and call your witnesses other than God if you are truthful in what you claim. And then the Quran then indicates in the following verse that it cannot be done. وَإِن لَمْ تَفْعَلُوا وَلَنْ تَفْعَلُوا. And if you do not do it, and you will not do it, فَاتَّقُوا النَّارَ الَّتِي وَقُودُهَا النَّاسُ وَالْحِجَارَةُ. then if you do not do it and you will not do it, then prepare yourself for the fire, the fuel of which is men and stones. So that's remarkable. Billions of books have been written in the world. Why not another one like the Quran? Even though people are trying to disprove it. And they've spent so much resources to try to disprove the Quran. All they had to do is produce a book like it to show that this is humanly possible. But there must have been a deeper meaning than that when the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was reciting these verses to his contemporaries. The point in the Quran seems to be that the Prophet Muhammad lived with his people a whole lifetime prior to his declaring this Quran. 40 years old he was before he received his first revelation. And for them, that was a sufficient time in which a person would have proven his character to his society. So they know him now to be a truthful and trustworthy person. Now can they imagine that a truthful person, as Muhammad, as they have known him, would have concocted such a lie and blamed it on God? We know that sometimes people tell a little lie some of the time, but some people will say, look, I cannot tell that one, that's a big one. Somebody may call in saying, I have a cold today, I'm not coming into work. But one wouldn't call in and say, my grandmother died. You see, there's a difference between the two kinds of lie. And some depraved person may actually say the second one too, but most of us will not. So can you imagine what one of us here, ordinary human being, a reasonable person, he starts claiming that God has given him a revelation. And we know him to be a sane person, we know him to be generally reasonable and honest and upright. That's hard to imagine. And then it's hard to imagine doing it yourself. So the Quran is saying, if you think that Muhammad did this, then okay, you do it yourself. Show us how easy it is for somebody to do that. And you see right away that it is not easy for somebody to do that. So why imagine this worst case scenario in the case of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him? To continue, there are statements in the Quran which are not meant to teach us science, because the Quran is not a science book. The Quran is a book of guidance on how we should relate to God who created us. But at the same time, the Quran draws our attention to physical phenomena for a variety of reasons. One, for us to see the grandeur of God and the things that He created. Second, for us to recognize our own humility and to see our place in the larger universe that God created. So God draws our attention to the things around us in order to drive home a certain point. But what is interesting is that the way in which the Quran speaks about the things around us, it gives us indications that whoever is telling us the words of this book knows the science that we are now discovering. And that's remarkable. It's almost like you're listening to a person delivering a lecture and he's speaking to us about contemporary topics, but suddenly he quotes Shakespeare. He doesn't say explicitly, I am quoting Shakespeare, but the words that he uses gives you the idea that this man has read Shakespeare. Because he's using words like as you like it, he's speaking of Hamlet, and so on. So you say, okay, he has read Shakespeare. There are some indicators there. In a similar way, while the Quran is telling us about our place in the universe, it's telling us in such a way that one hears that and say, whoever is saying this knows the science that we just discovered only recently. So who is that? Let's see. Well, what scientists are finding is that there is a correspondence between the physical descriptions that are found in the Quran and our own description of physical reality. And those descriptions of the Quran obviously are ahead of the time that the Quran was written. Surah 21, for example, in verse number 30, asks, أَوَلَمْ يَرَ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا أَنَّ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضَ كَانَتَا رَتْقًا فَفَتَحْنَاهُمَا. Don't the non-believers see that the heavens and the earth were together as one piece before we split them asunder? In fact, that is precisely a modern position on the formation of the heavens and the earth, that in fact from a singular explosion everything came into being, all the stars and galaxies and planets and so on. And yet that is in the Quran some 1400 years ago. The Quran also speaks about the expansion of the universe in Surah 51, verse number 47. So how could that sort of information get into the Quran, a book written some 1400 years ago,